If you'd like to ask a question during the program, you can do so by signing into YouTube and leaving a comment. Or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can leave a public comment there as well. And your questions will be fielded by Detroit Institute of Arts Manager of Volunteer Development, Christine Mark. But now let's get started with Pamela, Ray, and Cindy. Hi.
Hi, hey Ian, thanks so much.
Yep.
Cindy and Pamela, great to be with you.
Hey, Ray.
I'm very excited about today's tour. Art has this unique ability to communicate simultaneously on emotional, sensory, intellectual, and spiritual levels. For the visual arts, we observe sense, feel, and find meaning by unpacking our perceptions. Consequently, art can be powerful and persuasive, challenging our understanding of the world. It can provide a window into our society, offering insight and focus on complex social issues, presenting unique interpretations, and raising difficult questions. Our virtual tour today concerns some of the many works in the DIA's collection that communicate ideas and emotions associated with pressing societal topics and the human condition. We hope that our presentation today will be entertaining, but also will provide insight into art's role in the conversation regarding moral and social issues. Cindy, you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Ray. The first artwork that we're going to be talking about is a conceptual work of art. So I thought I'd start by just giving a quick description of what that means. Conceptual art installations are creations where the concept or idea takes precedence over the technical and material concerns. So by that, I mean the idea really takes front and center over the actual art making. In conceptual art, the idea is the most important aspect of the work, and the idea becomes the machine that makes the art. So first we're starting with To Disembark, Billie Holiday, created in 1993 by Glenn Ligon. It's a wooden packing crate, which is about 3 feet by 2 feet. And you can see it has printed logos of shipping instructions on the sides. And inside there is a tape player. This work of art was inspired by the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks, which deals with remnants of slavery and its manifestation into contemporary racism. It alludes to the story of Henry Box Brown, whose escape to freedom was memorialized in the narrative of the same title. By exploring slavery's painful past, Glenn Ligon hopes to understand his own. With this installation, he invites the viewer, us, to participate in the same process, the arrival at the end of an arduous journey. Next slide, please. So the narrative of Henry Box Brown. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Brown. In 1849, Brown, who was an enslaved man and worked in a tobacco processing factory in Richmond, Virginia, had himself shipped to freedom in Philadelphia with the help of a local shoemaker, Samuel Smith. He was packed in a crate and disguised as dry goods. He paid $84 to have himself nailed into a 3 by 2 by 2.5 foot crate and shipped 275 miles. Brown was 5'10" and 200 pounds, and he endured a 26-hour-long journey in a very crowded container. The box was roughly mishandled. It was placed upside down and shipped overland by express stage wagon. Amazingly, he survived. Upon his arrival in Philadelphia, he was received by a member of the Underground Railroad. He spent the remainder of his life as a world-renowned speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society, but he was never to see his wife, Nancy, or his 3 children again. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is you can see it's a lithograph titled The Resurrection of Henry Box Brown at Philadelphia, and it comes from the Library of Congress. And in this lithograph from 1850, our escaped fugitive emerges from his shipping container at the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. To our left, I should say, is Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist, and he is holding the pry bar that opens the crate. As he was uncrated, Brown broke into a hymn which was based on the Bible's 40th Psalm, which reads, "Do not withhold your mercy from me, O Lord." It was sung to the tune of a popular song of the time called Uncle Ned. We can go to the next. Thank you. So again, inside of this crate, there is a tape player, and from it comes a barely audible sound, and it's a song that's sung by Billie Holiday. Next. So the box emits this recording of Strange Fruit, a song that was made famous by Billie Holiday. It was written in reaction to a disturbing photograph of the lynching of two African-American men who had been accused of armed robbery and murder in the year 1930. News of this lynching, this horrific lynching, was spread across the world. Abel Mirapol, a Jewish schoolteacher, wrote the poem for Strange Fruit and later the lyrics and the music. Billie Holiday performed the song around the world, and it became the anthem for the anti-slavery movement. Next, please. Thank you, Jim.
Cindy, and it's haunting. In that
It is haunting, and you know, when we first started here at the DIA in 2007, my class, we actually did some of the school tours. And so sometimes we would come in early in the morning before the museum opened to make sure that everything that we were going to talk about was still in place. You know, sometimes things get taken off view or might be moved in the middle of the night. And I always remember walking into the gallery, up in the African-American contemporary galleries, walking into that gallery when the lights were still quite low and hearing that haunting melody. And I have to tell you, it really was, it was haunting. It is haunting.
It's an extremely emotional rendition of the song.
It really is.
Such a wonderful compliment to the, as you were saying, the concept of the piece.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is a photograph of To Disembark 1993, which was an exhibition at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. And here we had 9 audio sculpture crates and a suite of prints. So Lion placed this array of 9 wooden crates paired with audio tracks in this gallery space. And as I said, they were accompanied by 10 lithographs, which memorialized the broadsheets that were circulated in the 1800s to advertise for the return of fugitives who had escaped the bondages of slavery. Each crate was outfitted with a tape recorder that emitted a low level of barely audible sound. I'll give you an example of a few of them. One had spirituals by the McIntosh County Shouters. One of them had, of course, The Haunting Lament by Billie Holiday. Another one had rap music by BRS-1, Sound of the Police. And another one had a heartbeat. Wow. So our To Disembark crate was one of the original 9. Next, please. And a little bit about Glenn Ligon. The 3 artists that I'm talking about today are all contemporary artists who are still living, which is interesting in and of itself. Glenn Ligon graduated from Wesleyan with a BFA in the Whitney Museum. He did independent study. He identifies himself as an abstract expressionist artist. And with Disembark, he created a form that was capable of identifying the enslaved man without requiring his actual appearance. I thought that was a pretty powerful statement, and I think it's a really deep thought, and how brilliant he was to, you know, bring forth this social issue without even showing Henry Box Brown. It's his story, but I guess we could call it another portrait in absentia. He's intent on reframing Black history by filtering his own identity as a Black man through 3-dimensional art installations inspired by the literary works of people like Gwendolyn Brooks, who I mentioned earlier, and James Baldwin. By exploring slavery's painful past, he hopes to have a better understanding of his own history. And African Americans are still trying to disembark. And with these installations, Ligon invites the viewer to participate in the same process. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. That was wonderful. I wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment box there. You can see it coming across the screen. Just want to make sure, just in case any of the viewers today have any questions. But now we're going to turn to a piece that's in the same gallery as To Disembark, and this a wonderful recent acquisition by the DAA. Pamela?
Thank you, Ray. White on White Stone Mountain is an oil on canvas created by Detroiter Tylon J. Sawyer. Next slide, please. Tylon J. Sawyer is an American multidisciplinary artist, educator, curator, and social activist. His work juxtaposes themes of identity, both individual and collective, with investigations of race and history in popular culture. Born and raised in Detroit, Sawyer's work has been exhibited in both solo and group exhibitions throughout the United States and abroad. Next slide, please. White on White Stone Mountain is one of the largest and most complex paintings Sawyer has created. The 14 by 6 foot oil painting pictures Stone Mountain, the Stone Mountain Monument in Georgia. Can we go to the next slide so we can take a Stone Mountain Monument in Georgia, a massive stone memorial carving that honors the leaders of the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis and Civil War generals Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Next slide, please.
This is, Cindy, I don't know if you've seen this. This is a powerful painting. It's really large, as Pamela was saying. It's very impressive, and it's just recently been put up in the African American Gallery.
Yes, it's a new, as you said, it's a new acquisition, and it's the first that the Junior Council, I believe, purchased. Sawyer deconstructs this homage to the Confederacy by juxtaposing images of Black men in white suits reclined about it. The men are rendered tossing and turning as they struggle to find physical comfort and some measure of peace, all the while being pressed against a massive rock that glorifies their oppression. All the men are dressed in white suits, so the viewer doesn't focus on just one. All are writhing in discomfort in response to systemic racism. This powerful image successfully evokes the anxiety of being Black in America. Sawyer, both artist and activist, examines the historical narratives and imagery to determine their role in what's happening in America today. Sawyer said, quote, "Being Black, I'm going back to those histories, the Renaissance, antebellum South, and seeing places where people of color were involved and starting to make the corrections. Or I'm creating pieces of work that might be sort of like visual poetry to see how something that was being created then really affects what's happening now." I want to go to the next slide, please, Jim. Thank you. I want to just take a look at how race and history he identifies or addresses, I should say, not identifies, but addresses in some of his other paintings. The painting on your left with the mother and the son, it's called Pieta, and it borrows from the iconic Michelangelo sculpture of the same name, which simply means pity in Italian. In Michelangelo's version, the crucified Jesus is draped across his mother's lap as she cradles him in sorrow. In Sawyer's version, Mary is replaced by a Black woman whose face is both weary and determined. In her lap is not the crucified Jesus, but her murdered teenage son wearing a hoodie. Behind them hangs the nod to Americana, the stars and stripes. It's hard to look at Sawyer's Piata and not feel the angst and anger of the Black mother and child. The allusion to Trayvon Martin and the Black Lives Matter movement is unmistakable. In the painting to its right, it's called Post Hope, and the collapsed figure is a visionary strategy that Sawyer uses in his portraiture. In this painting, Post Hope, a Black man in a dark suit is sprawled face down upon a flag. Behind his back, he holds a mask of Barack Obama. Is the man exhausted, defeated, dead? We don't know. Within the stripes within the stripes of the flag are papered in the white stripes of the flag are papered over in full photographic images of the Black struggle in America. And there are images from Klan rallies, from Sandra Bland, to iconic pop cultures. The final slide, please. Next slide. But even amid its controversial and racist symbolism, Sawyer views Stone Mountain as an artistic achievement that, however, is followed by a deeper narrative. Sawyer said, I think, regardless of it representing America's racist past or projecting aspects of the present, it's still, I think, one of the most beautiful pieces of public art I've ever seen. It's an amazing sculpture, but simultaneously, it's also a symbol of how hard people fought to maintain a system that oppressed people that look like me. Sawyer offers a simple way to look at this image. He said, the piece is about the anxiety of being Black in America and constantly being reminded of Blackness or having to exist within this sort of racist environment.
Really powerful, Pamela. Very powerful. Christine, before we move on to the next piece, we should inquire if there are any questions.
That was just so incredible to listen to, Pamela. No, we had one comment, and it's just that the viewers said that they really love that we've included local Detroit artists this time around. So, thank you.
Well, we have more to come. Yeah, and this young artist is particularly talented. So, shall we go to the next slide, Jim? Thank you. In 1951, the American artist Ben Shahn created this 4.5 foot by 3.5 foot painting composition for clarinets and tin horn. Shahn was born into a family of Jewish craftsmen in Lithuania, then the Russian Republic. They faced political, social, and religious inequalities and really extreme persecution. In fact, Shahn's father was exiled to Siberia by the Russian government. The family then immigrated to the United States when Shahn was only 8 years old, and they did so, obviously, for the promise of freedom. When Shahn painted this work, abstract expressionism dominated American painting after World War II. And an example of abstract expressionism from the DIA's collection is on the right. Shahn rejected the abstract and developed his own manner of realism that was both original and influential. This style facilitated seeing the world through his eyes, through the eyes of a sensitive and sincere artist whose interest lies in the reality of human relationships. Particularly of interest to him was political and social relationships. likely because of his early experience with his family and the Russian government. Accordingly, this style was labeled by art scholars as, quote, social realism. Sean's art mainly focused on social issues which revealed his socialist beliefs and leanings. Interestingly, and I think this is really interesting, Pamela and Cindy, in 1933, Sean assisted Diego Rivera with this fresco called Man at the Crossroads for the Rockefeller Center in New York City. Rivera, of course, created the famous Detroit industry murals at the DIA. This politically charged Rockefeller Center mural was actually torn down after it was completed because Rivera included a portrait of the communist leader Lenin, the arrow points to the portrait, which Rivera refused to remove despite being repeatedly asked. Composition for Clarinets and Tin Horn is a social and political commentary on the United States government's McCarthy era of the 1940s and 50s. After World War II, there was substantial paranoia in the United States regarding communism, which came to be known or is historically known as the Red Scare. In fact, the Congress, the House and Congress formed a committee called the Committee on Un-American Activities to root out and condemn communism in the United States. Over a period of years bridging the 1940s and the 1950s, this committee held a series of infamous hearings which included assaults on the arts and the media. No one, not even Walt Disney, was above the committee's suspicion. Walt Disney was above the committee's suspicion and was subpoenaed to testify before the committee. Those the committee identified as communists were blacklisted, resulting in severe professional and personal difficulties and prejudice, including potential criminal prosecution. The committee condemned modern American art, including Sean's works, because of the perceived leftist political messaging. Indeed, in 1949, during one of his series of notorious congressional diatribes against American modern art, Michigan Representative George Dondero disparaged Sean as, quote, one of the pets of the Museum of Modern Art, while accusing the Museum of Modern Art at being the center of a communist plot or a conspiracy. Dondero later accused Sean of having revolutionary aims, and he called a broad group of socially engaged artists, including Sean, quote, soldiers of the revolution in smocks, end of quote. The FBI this is incredible. The FBI had started a file on Sean in the 1940s, noting that his work had shown a, quote, tendency to play up the lower class, end of quote. In the aftermath of Dondero's speeches, Sean's home and studio in Roosevelt, New Jersey, were put under FBI surveillance. And in 1952, the FBI went so far as to explore the possibility of deporting the artist upon finding no record of his application for American citizenship following his childhood immigration. In 1951, Ben Sean was subpoenaed to testify before the Committee on Un-American Activities. He was aggressively and unrespectfully questioned for his left-wing political views and his anti-war position. How ironic that Sean's family escaped the persecution of the Russian government, only to have Sean years later face the persecution of the United States government over his works of art. Now, as only art can seem to do, Compositions for Clarinets and Tin Horn communicates the emotional and spiritual agony Sean and others suffered due to the persecution of the United States government. Sean uses two main compositional elements to communicate this terrible suffering. The first, the artist places the figure behind a series of 5 clarinets in a tin horn with a clown on it. And the tin horn is strategically placed in front, directly in front of the figure. The musical instruments reference not just music, but art generally, and the clarinets align in such a way as to suggest prison bars or a figure being trapped in a cage, symbolizing the persecution being experienced by artists. The clarinets actually show emotion, if you look at the top particularly, such as crying, screaming, and are on fire, suggesting anger. The tin horn is placed in front of the figure, and it seems to simultaneously communicate different meanings, such as being trapped as a pawn for the political motives of the politicians, being used almost as a gesture for the entertainment of the politicians. Or it could be representing the pressure Sean faced to name individuals who embraced communist beliefs. This was then called the so-called naming names. Or maybe it's just perhaps a recognition of the futility of the situation. The second compositional element is the form of the figure in the back. You can see great grief and anxiety in the clutching hands and the head being so buried into those hands that it disappears. The DIA's collection includes studies of that Sean created as he was developing this composition of physical and emotional anguish. Here are 4 of those studies, which reveal Sean's experimentation with different expressive arrangements. Notice how Sean changes the lines on the figures as he tries to find the right configuration to communicate grief and anxiety. Also in these sketches, we see the figure is transposed from an erect, thoughtful position into a compressed and taut position of the final version. Then you have these hard, tight brush strokes. Sean gradually redefines and strengthens the power of his drawing through his painting. Now, Sean used tempera instead of oil paint, and it applies it in a series of textual overlays to build the tone and to have that great intensity of color. This particular piece is on the 2nd floor in the hallway, north hallway of the DIA. And it's like many of these pieces, the slides just don't do it justice. The vividness of the colors have to be seen in person. There are these strong contrasts. We've got these vibrant blue, violet, and crimson tones. And then you've got this punctuation of the background, the lighter background, and the dark mahogany-like darks, and these sharp white accents. So altogether, Sean creates an emotionally charged image addressing the difficult political climate of the day. But it's a picture that transcends its time. It's beyond its time. It becomes a universal message, a universal image of the suffering of those unfairly subject to political prosecution. Cindy, I think you're up.
Thanks, Ray. When we were having our rehearsal a little earlier, and Pamela was going through her slides, I noticed and I thought about the fact that in Stone Mountain, the figures are positioned an awful lot like the figures are in this painting, Autobiography, Air CS 560. Although in the work of art that Pamela was talking about, they were writhing and alive. And in this work of art, all of these folks are gone. So the title is the name of a tear gas that's manufactured in Howardina Pindell's home state of Pennsylvania. And it was used against the Palestinians during the 6-year First Intifada Palestinian-Israeli uprising. It was also used in the Vietnam and Gulf Wars. Following an auto accident in 1979, which resulted in memory loss, Pindell began using her art practice to reconstruct her own memory. Her autobiography series is a group of artworks which came from childhood experiences, travel, and her engagement in current events. The canvas is prepared with gesso, which is infused with Pindel's own blood. It has acrylic and tempera paint, a polymer photo transfer, and also oil stick or pastel. You can see that it's an irregularly shaped, cut and sewn together canvas. It's unstretched with very raw edges. And she uses a unidirectional paint application, which suggests all over weaving, like the weaving of fabric. This painting is part of a subset devoted to the elements. And the elements are water, fire, earth, and of course, air. If we can go to the next, please. So let's see, Pindell, I want to tell you about her. You know what, I'm sorry, go back for a minute. I want to talk a little bit more about the figures. Thank you, Jim. So the stencils of her own body are floating in this composition, and they are demarcated from the background with broken black lines. On the bottom right, we have a figure that is stretched flat, face down. And note the text on top of the figure, it says buried alive. I don't know if you can point it out, Jim. It's right next to how dare you question. Thank you. At the bottom left in profile, we have arms and legs in motion running from raids on a hospital. And the text there says Ramallah Hospital. I don't know if we're able to pick that out. I think it might be a little bit too small. In the upper left, there's a torso with arms stretched over its head. And the text there says Iron Fist. And then in the upper right corner, we have a head fragment that's kind of floating off the outer edge of the canvas with an arm outstretched. And the text here says Iron Fist of Censorship. We can go to the next, please. Thank you, Jim. So Howardina Pindell, she's 79 years old. She went to Boston University and got her MFA from Yale. She co-founded the Air Gallery in New York, which is still in existence. And AIR stands for Artist in Residence. It was the first gallery in the USA directed toward exhibiting works by women artists. Isn't that amazing? You would have thought that that would have happened much earlier, but not so. She was a curator for a time at MoMA, and she is still teaching at Stony Brook University in New York. If we could go to the next, Jim. So here we have a call out. You can see the arrow is pointing to the word assassination. So her painting is called a text-laden painting. You can see why. Paper cutouts of black text are applied in overlays. And it really isn't just a painting, it's a painting and a collage. The racial messages by Pindell, who holds deeply felt convictions and a commitment to oppression and racism. The racial messages point to that. Next slide, please. Here, the arrow's pointing into the center of the painting to the phrase, "How dare you question?" So overlaid with this text, it's an indictment of the Israeli press, which whitewashed the facts of the Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation from 1987 to 1993. And it contributed to their continued oppression. And when I'm looking at this and I'm talking about, you know, the press whitewashing facts, it certainly is echoed in our contemporary world today. The press is often guilty of massaging and whitewashing facts. Next, we'll go to an inset from that same central area of the painting. And in the absolute center of the painting, there's a photo. Above it, you can see beaten. And it's a photo from the New York Times at the time that this was created. And it's of a beaten Palestinian man with bandages around his head. And she says that she is illustrating man's inhumanity to man and the oppression of people throughout the world. With this painting, she movingly expresses and cautions against international genocide, war, and human rights violations. It's a really powerful piece. I encourage you, if you're at the museum, it's in our African American galleries, and it's quite large. I think it's about 7 by 7 feet, so you can't miss it.
terrific, Cindy. Thanks so much.
Mhm.
Pamela, I think you're up.
I'm up next. Okay. This piece of art is entitled Bird, 1990 by David Hammonds. David Hammonds, let's see, this particular sculpture or piece of art is over 6 feet tall and almost 2 feet wide. It is painted metal, wire, a basketball, and feathers. Next slide, please. To tell you a little bit about David Hammonds. In 1943, Hammonds was born to a poor family in Springfield, Illinois. He was the youngest of 10 children. He moved to LA in the early 1960s to study art. In 1973, he moved to New York City to further his art career. The subject matter of Hammond's art was influenced by activist artists such as Charles White, who taught Hammonds at the Otis College of Art and Design in LA. While the style of his art was influenced by artists like Marcel Duchamp, who used ready-made objects such as found objects. Our curator, Valerie Mercer, describes Hammond as a conceptual artist who works in a variety of media, but has a distinct approach, creating unique sculptures that combined found and discarded objects. Hammond carefully selected the objects he uses to inform the subject matter of his art. In other words, the nature of the discarded object furthers the meaning Hammond intends to communicate. Hammond exploits an object's ability to signify culture and, by implication, represent economic and political narratives about America, particularly the African American experience in America. Next slide, please, Jim. 6 feet tall, a 6-foot tall bird cage, a used basketball, chicken wire, and feathers. Bird is layered in social and political meanings. When it was acquired in 2016, the DIA director, Salvatore Pons, explained the piece as follows. Historically, the African American community has been given opportunities in sports and music and has excelled in those areas, but it has been denied other opportunities and is still caged. So one interpretation of this work is that historically in white America, the only real opportunities for Blacks has been in athletics and entertainment and not in other professions or careers. The white fancy bird cage is in the style of American Victorian, which was popular in the 1800s when slavery and thereafter Jim Crow segregation laws existed. It can be seen as a metaphor for the white establishment and symbolizing the lack of opportunities beyond the cage. Next slide, please. The basketball with feathers encased in barbed wire. Now, the barbed wire further communicates being trapped or the lack of opportunity. The basketball refers to athletics, in this case, particularly basketball, and the feathers and the title bird refers to entertainment, specifically Charlie Parker, a famous jazz saxophonist and composer nicknamed Bird, who Hammonds greatly admired. In fact, Hammonds did various works called Bird, which focused on Parker. Next slide, please. With this work, Hammonds also could be communicating that young African Americans should abandon the limited perspective of opportunity and through insight be inspired to explore other career paths. While in the last 25 years, Hammond's art has been widely recognized, MoMA owns 18 pieces. Hammond is known to be famously reclusive. He is quite private and does not give interviews, but he does spend time mentoring young artists. His avoidance of the public eye or publicity may be because he believes that his art should speak for him. In 1971, he wrote, I feel my art relates to my total environment, my being Black, political, and social, a human being. Although I am involved in communicating with others, I believe that my art itself is really my statement. For me, it has to be. There we have Bird.
It's a well constructed piece that, as we are seeing all these pieces, communicates that social issue in such a powerful way, such a thoughtful way, with the bird cage being the Victorian, from the American Victorian style that was famous during slavery in the Jim Crow period. And what an elegant way to demonstrate that sort of trapped feeling.
And I also was thinking with the height of that particular sculpture, it almost makes you feel like a basketball player is there, tall and thin.
Sure. So I think it's me, isn't it? I'm next. So, from one somewhat difficult subject matter to another somewhat difficult subject matter. This is a small painting. But it's extremely powerful. It's called The Fire Next Time, and it's by the American artist Vincent Smith. The painting is only 24 inches tall and 34 inches wide, but its colors, its texture, and the subject matter generate an immense impression. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, Smith was an artist who worked in various mediums, often combining representational with abstract styles. Smith was deeply influenced by the stark and simple forms of the works of Jacob Lawrence, and we have an example of Jacob Lawrence painting, thanks Jim, in the center. He was also influenced by the bold colors and thick application of paint and shapes of the expressionist art, which you can see on the top right. We have an example of an expressionist work. And then he further was influenced by the flat perspective, the two-dimensional perspective made famous by Cezanne. And we have an example of a Cezanne on the bottom right. African art also played a major inspiration for Smith, as he viewed his art as a marriage of the art of the West and of Africa. And you can see that inspiration in the photo to the left, as Smith is working on a piece that is certainly and clearly influenced by African art. Smith's early successful works concerned contemporary African and African American urban and everyday life. His focus on this particular subject matter was in part his reaction to what he saw in mainstream art, what he saw in museums. As he stated, quote, I didn't see anything reflecting the Black experience or the Black contribution to American culture, end of quote. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights protesters, activists, and political prisoners became a major part of Smith's artistic focus. He was an active member of the Black Arts Movement, which was founded by his friend, playwright Amari Baraka. It was a Black Pride movement that was particularly vigorous and action-oriented. And there's a photo there to the left of members of the movement, including Baraka. He's in the center. Smith's painting, The Fire Next Time, exemplifies the social and political concerns of those writers and artists associated with the movement. This painting, Smith's painting, was inspired by the profound American the profound American society observer, James Baldwin, and his 1962 book, The Fire Next Time. The book essentially was a warning, cautioning of the consequences of continued racial injustice, policies of discrimination, and racial oppression, denying civil rights to African American citizens. This work was painted in 1968, which was a particularly turbulent year of social and political unrest in America, with demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, rebellions in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The painting shows four men reacting in shock and anguish as they escape the fire behind them. The fire is depicted as this violent burst of color, is perhaps suggesting an explosion. The men's faces are composed of simple shapes and lines, but communicate their troubled emotions. The artist, Smith, used oil paint and sand together, and it creates this really gritty, 3D texturally painting surface. You can see why our curator for African American art, Valerie Mercer, who Pamela just referenced, she describes Smith as a, quote, gritty, figurative expressionist. And when you're before this painting, you can very much see it. This painting is raw and powerful, and it evokes emotions of despair, anguish, and resolve. And while it's the smallest painting in the gallery in which it's currently hung, it is catches your eye by its colors and the texture of the paint surface. Christine, if we have no questions, we'll go on to Cindy.
Okay, Ray, we haven't really had a lot of questions. I think the subject matter is just so deep, we're all listening so intently.
Thanks so much, Cindy.
For those of you who listened in last month, you may be familiar with this because our man behind the scenes today, Jim O'Malley, actually did part of his presentation on atrabiliarios. I want to talk a little bit about a personal experience I had with this. I started training 100 years ago in 2006, and the museum at the time was closed for renovation. The only galleries that were open were the two that are on either side of the Woodward entrance, which is now Baroque art, and on the other side is American. So when we trained, we were training from a book of Xerox copies of artwork, which isn't the best way to train. It's really not, the best advantage. But I remember when I came across this particular image, and I was shocked, stunned, curious. When I read the story of it, I was so anxious to see this in reality and see it installed that like every other week I would sneak up to the contemporary galleries to see if it was in the wall yet. And when it finally went up, I have to tell you, it threw me back across the room. It's just so powerful. So this is Atrabiliarios. It's by the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo. From Jim's research, he found that the Spanish words atra and bills are Spanish for morning. And when they are transformed into atrabiliarios, they then become the meaning defiant. And that defiance goes forward with ongoing courage and resistance. In this three-dimensional work of art, which is inset into the drywall in that gallery, the covering over the niches is animal skin. And the animal skin creates kind of a translucent, sort of milky covering, which really obscures your view of what's inside. The animal skin was taken from slaughterhouses and is a direct reference to flaying and torture. In the niches, it's suggested, the niches are a suggestion of those that are used to store religious icons or objects in churches, things that are precious, sacred, and they're also reminiscent of the Latin altarpiece tradition. And if you were at the DIA in the last few weeks, you probably saw all of our Latin ofrenda altarpieces. So kind of in that tradition. The sutures that go around the niches and attach the animal skin to the wall are made with surgical thread, and they're crudely sewn, and the sutures suggest maybe the suturing of deep wounds. The shoes that are inside singly and in pairs are placed in shoebox-sized niches, and they're a metaphor for the body's absence. They're meant to evoke a sense of loss, and they were collected by Salcedo from the families of the deceased. This points to the practice of disappearing people, and disappearing, I'm going to say in quotes. It harkens back to the time of even the Spanish Inquisition, and this practice was brought to South America by the Spanish colonizers. The shoes are an example of the tragic and mysterious disappearance of women by Colombian paramilitary and guerrilla forces during the coups and the drug wars of the 1980s. Gone without a trace, the disappeared families are left with grieving the fate of the missing. The victims weren't just forcibly taken, but also tortured before being killed. So this is really just such a sad and horrific commentary on this just murderous and torturous practice. Next slide, please. So here we have an inset of a pair of the shoes so that you can get a little bit better of an idea of what that milky presence looks like. Next, please. So Doris Salcedo, she's 66 years old. She's a graduate of Columbia University and got her MFA from New York University, but now she resides in Bogota, Colombia. Her work centers on the pain, trauma, and loss stemming from her own personal history because members of her own family were disappeared. Her intention is to bring to focus all those who have been violently taken and killed around the world. Salcedo uses her art to expose this painful cultural, social, and political reality of kidnapping and torture. Her art acts as a tool for us to examine our world and our own personal role within it. And if we can go to the next, please, Jim. This is not a work in the DIA's permanent collection, but I show it to you just to give you an idea of other methods that she uses to show the emptiness of people who have been lost. So this is actually untitled. You can see it was created in 2003 for the 8th International Biennial in Istanbul, Turkey. So the emptiness of discarded objects that were once used by and held human beings, 1,500 chairs. It addresses the history of migration and displacement in Istanbul over a 50-year period. When she traveled there, she noticed a lot of abandoned buildings and spaces where the ruins, had been carved out. So she felt that these abandoned buildings were the legacy of forced removal of Greeks and Jews from Turkey. This violent past still persists and is a practice that is still very much alive the world over. And if we could go to the last, please. Thank you, Jim. So Atrabiliaros is based upon the multiple portraits in absentia of the disappeared. The dead are permanently suspended in a void between the present and the past. The death of a loved one can be mourned, but when they have been disappeared, the grief is exponential, leaving an unbearable emptiness for those that are left behind.
Cindy, every time I'm in the gallery, when this is on view, I'm always drawn to it. It has a very haunting and just so piercing draw for me. I wonder who the persons were who wore those shoes, what was their life like, but it's just, it always, I can't just walk through that gallery without going right up to those shoes.
And in Jim's research, he found that sometimes they actually used the shoes in some of the mass burials. They used the shoes to identify the bodies,
Right.
because they are such a personal object.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
Pamela, we've got a few minutes. You want Benny Andrews, our wonderful Southern pasture painting?
I think I want to save it. I don't want to rush through it. It's such a rich background, and I think it's a very significant painting that warrants having the
Good enough.
needs.
Good enough. So we'll conclude today then. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. And I wanted to remind you that we have some wonderful programming next week on Thursdays at the museum. There'll be other docents that will be here. Jan, Kathleen, and Deb will be presenting Native American art of the DIA's collection. I also want to remind you of some amazing exhibitions that are going on in the DIA. Of course, there is the blockbuster and a serious blockbuster exhibit, Van Gogh in America, which runs through January 22nd. You need a separate prepaid ticket to enter the exhibition, and it's worth double, triple the price. It is 74 Van Goghs, some of them, 8 of them from private collections, all together at in the special exhibition room on the second floor of the DIA. It is really a triumphant exhibition, and I encourage everyone to go to experience it. There's also 3 exhibitions that don't require a special ticket. It comes with your admission. There's an exhibition on the second floor off Rivera Court called Van Gogh's Artistic Roots, and it explores the origins of the messaging of Van Gogh and the subject matter of Van Gogh. There's also on the first floor a wonderful exhibition about printmaking. It's called Printmaking in the 21st Century, and that runs through April 9th. And Cindy and Pamela were just talking about it before we got on, about how just spectacular that particular exhibition is. And again, it's free. And finally, for those who love photography, again on the first floor is an exhibition called Conscious Response, and that runs through January 8th. So we thank you all for joining us, and please join us again next week. Thank you.